Barbara, come on. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad to have you with us tonight. My name is Adelicia Hayes Franklin Acklin Cheatham. Allow me to present to you my second husband, Colonel Joseph Acklin.
Good evening. Let me add my welcome to Adelicia's. She and I were married in 1849 and soon began work on the estate.
Joseph,
That would be known. Yes.
you're getting into the story.
What do you mean? This is our story.
This is our story, but our story has to start with Isaac Franklin.
Well,
Because without
well.
with Mr. Franklin, we'd have a very different story.
Very well. Go ahead and begin with Mr. Franklin, but please be brief. I do get rather tired of hearing about how wealthy and how successful he was. After all, I did fight in the Texas Revolution against Mexico, earned the rank of colonel, later a law degree, and Isaac was a slave dealer.
Joseph, I know you did not approve of Mr. Franklin's profession. To his credit, Isaac never approved of slave labor, and we did our best to try to ease the burdens of those that we did employ. You see, I met Mr. Franklin on a business trip. I accompanied my father on a business trip to Gallatin, Tennessee, to the Fairview plantation. I wrote in the man's guest book that I liked his house and had set my cap for its owner. That was most audacious for a Victorian lady, and my mother would have been scandalized had she known. However, when Mr. Franklin returned from his own business trip, it didn't take him long to follow up on my boast, and in 1839, he and I were married. Now, even though he was almost twice my age, it was a very happy marriage, and it produced 4 children, 3 daughters and a son who only lived for 13 hours. Now, Joseph had very little formal education. Mr. Franklin had very little formal education and was pretty much a self-made man, and he did profit from the slave trade. But he had given that profession up long before he met me. You see, my father would never have allowed me to marry a slave trader. Mr. Franklin built his plantation Fairview in 1832, and it some 2,000 acres just south of Gallatin. And it was declared the finest in the state, not excepting President Jackson's prestigious Hermitage. On that plantation, we raised cattle, horses, and grain. There were 3 plantations that he also owned in Louisiana, and on these we grew cotton, and that's where we spent our winters. Let's see. I've forgotten where I was going with this. Oh, that's right.
We're old, and when you get this way, you do forget sometimes.
Let me see now. What was I saying? Mr. Franklin obviously was a very wealthy man, and when he died on the plantations there in Louisiana very suddenly, I became an extremely wealthy widow. Within weeks of his death, our 2 oldest daughters, Victoria and Adelicia, also died. I returned to Nashville with my youngest daughter, Emma Franklin. You know, Mr. Franklin had always wanted Fairview to be set aside as a school, but I understand that today it's being subdivided into estate lots. But at least Belmont's a school, and he would be very proud of that.
Well, now you're getting ahead of the story a little bit. I realize that he left you wealthy. But Adelicia, I'm the one that managed that and more than doubled all of our wealth. You see, in our day and time, women did not handle their own affairs. That was left up to the man of the house.
Yes, you need not remind me of the restrictions placed on ladies in our day.
Yes.
And I will admit, you were a good administrator and you managed our affairs quite well. You take the story from here. I'm not doing so well.
Well, Adelicia and I, we did marry in 1849 after being introduced at a ball given to Mrs. John Bell.
Ah, ladies, but not before the man signed a ironclad prenuptial agreement.
Yes, thank you, dear, for reminding me of that. Well, around 1850, we began work on the estate that would become our summer home, Belmont. And we would continue, however, to spend our winters on those Louisiana plantations. In Belmont, we had greenhouses where we grew exotic flowers and tropical fruits. There was a water tower that provided running water right up into our house. We also had a zoo with a bear house, and we had a rather large pond with an alligator. From the back of our house, you could see all the way into downtown Nashville, even see our beautiful state capitol building. In 1852, we finally got to move into our mansion.
We entertained lavishly at Belmont, and I like to plan my parties to coincide with the full moon so that the guests got the full benefit of the house and grounds as they came up the long driveways.
Well, on our Louisiana plantations, we raised cotton, as Alicia previously stated. These 3 plantations were located in Angola, a place that is now occupied by a notorious federal prison. It was in this area that we had some 750 slaves. Now, I never really cared personally for slave labor, but we must admit we were rather pleased when we were featured in a publication called The Southern Cultivator. They commended us for the care and treatment that we had given to our servants. And we always strongly felt that they should have good clothing, and food, and housing, and medical care. And we did see to it that those things were provided.
Joseph and I had 6 children. In 1855, though, our twin daughters, Laura and Corinne, both died. And later that same year, my daughter Emma Franklin also died.
Well, in 1861, everything in our world changed with the advent of the Civil War. We heard the news of the fall of Fort Donelson over in West Tennessee in church on a beautiful Sunday morning in February of 1862. The Confederate Army, they were in full retreat coming back into Nashville with the Union Army in hot pursuit. We reached a pretty quick decision that it would be best for me to go back and oversee the situations there on our plantations. Alicia would stay here in Nashville to care for our children and to look after Belmont. And these were very sad and very dangerous times. People did what they had to do just to survive. And by the summer of 1863, I was sick of it all. All I wanted to do was come home and be with my family. And sad to say, this was not going to be.
By August of 1863, I had not heard from Joseph in months, and I was frantic with worry. In September, I was informed that he too had died on the plantations there in Angola. I made a hurried trip to Louisiana in an effort to save the cotton crop that Joseph had been guarding from armies both north and south. We were finally able to load it onto a gunboat that ran the naval blockade of New Orleans and safely reached the Rothschild family, who sold it for $960,000. After the war, I traveled extensively in Europe. I did some shopping and then returned home to marry once again. This time I married a widower, Dr. William Cheatham. Dr. Cheatham had been widowed during the war. He and his wife had been arrested and sent to a prison camp up north. She was the sister of General John Hunt Morgan and suspected of passing on troop movement information to General Morgan. She died on the way there, and Dr. Cheatham was released and able to return to Nashville to continue his medical practice. We raised his 2 small children there at Belmont. In 1884, I sold Belmont and moved with my 3 adult children to Washington, D.C., where my oldest son had been a United States Senator. On a shopping trip to New York City in 1887, I became ill and I died there. My funeral was held here in Nashville at the Downtown Presbyterian Church, where I had been a lifelong member. If you're ever downtown and you hear the bells chime, I hope you'll think of me. I donated those bells to the church.
Well, we do thank you for coming to visit with us tonight. You know, it's still amazing after all these years how few visitors we're getting around here. We hope you'll come back next year and learn another chapter in the exciting history of Nashville's past. We bid you a good evening. Hope you enjoy the rest of your tour.
Fine, plenty of room.
Welcome. Bet you're wondering, who is she? Well, let me introduce myself to you. I'm Miss Jane Henry Thomas, called Miss Jane. I was born on September the 2nd, 1800, in Cumberland County, Virginia. My family started out from Virginia to come to Middle Tennessee with 2 6-horse-drawn wagons and 5 children. And my mother and my father rode on horseback through the wilderness, through the Cherokee Nation, and we arrived in Middle Tennessee on the 24th of December, 1804. It took roughly 3 months to come through the wilderness. Well, I had, my father rented 2 blockhouses from Mr. David McGavock, and that's where we lived. In 1815, I attended Mrs. Abercrombie's school, and some of the classmates married very prominent men. Among Sarah Childress, she married Mr. President Polk. And I forgot to tell you, there was something happened when I was 11 years old. There was an earthquake that hit Tennessee, and it lasted for about a year, and it formed Rearfoot Lake in West Tennessee. Probably the thing that happened in my life that I was most proud of was when I was 62 years old. I went to Virginia, to Warm Springs, to help take care of soldiers. I was sent from Nashville with medicine and clothing and bandages, and I was accompanied by Dr. William Bass. I think maybe later on this evening you're going to visit with him. I stayed there for about 2 months, and then I came back to Nashville. And I was given a house to turn into a hospital. And I set it up that way and took care of a number of soldiers. Well, we heard that Fort Donelson had fallen, and sometime during the night, some of the soldiers got up and left, all but 2 of them. So on Monday, I decided to close my hospital, and by Wednesday, you couldn't tell that there'd ever been a hospital there. The city of Nashville fell on the 25th of February of 1862. And I saw the men going up to the Capitol to raise the Yankee flag. There was a General Stedman took over my little cottage in Nashville, and he used it as headquarters. And that was just fine till he got ready to leave. And when he left, he took all my books, all my letters, all my papers. He took the grates out of the house, broke every pane of glass I had, and he cut down all my trees. So I couldn't stay in my cottage. But my brother had gone a little further south, and so I decided to take over his house. So I stayed there and actually took care of it for about 3 years. He had a hunting dog, and I became very fond of that hunting dog, and it liked to sleep at my door. Well, one morning that hunting dog decided he'd steal a steak from the Yankee cook. 2 or 3 days later, I found that hunting dog laying at my door dead. And I told the colonel, I said, that dog's been poisoned. And he said, no, it hadn't. I said, yes, I know that dog's been poisoned. So I just marched myself to my front door where all the Yankee tents were, and I told them, come here, I know you're going to want to go back north and show that you were brave and that you killed something. So I want you to take a little piece of this dead dog's hair back with you. Well, they didn't come. They just stayed in their tents. They just didn't want to have anything to do with that dead dog. Well, about 1895, I began to write my memoirs. I did it as columns, and they ran in the Daily American from 1895 to 1896. And 1897, they were turned into a book called Old Days in Nashville. Also in 1897, there was the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. It was held on the grounds where I think you call Centennial Park today. Well, I was given a complimentary pass to use whenever I wanted to, and I used it and went quite often. And by the way, there was a very interesting side bite to the fact that I was, because my book was published, I got a letter from a man out west, and he said he'd read all the columns, all the writings, and he thought I was a very sensible lady, and he proposed marriage to me. Well, after 9 decades, I found that quite amusing. Well, to remind myself of rule number 13 about you having your admission ticket to get into the cemetery, and I'm sure you must have done so, because nowhere amongst you do I see a single shovel or a pickaxe, so I know you're not here for grave robbers. You have a safe journey home. Good evening.
Cemetery. I'm Lieutenant Henry M. Doak, Confederate States Marine Corps. People may stand at ease, smoke them if you got them. No, the Confederacy actually had a Marine Corps. Not very well known, but we served all over the globe. We had Confederate Marines that served in the northern part of the Bering Sea, almost up to the Arctic Circle. We served in the North and South Atlantic, into the port of Gibraltar. Served in the South Pacific, the South China Sea. We had a Confederate Marine detachment at all the major ports of the Confederacy, up and down the East Coast and across the Gulf. We had a Confederate Marine gun crew that served on board the CSS Virginia in its famous battle against the USS Monitor, the first clash of the ironclad ships at Hampton Roads, Virginia. We also had a Marine gun crew that served on board the CSS Tennessee when the Tennessee took on Farragut's entire fleet in the Battle of Mobile Bay. Now, my story begins in August of 1841. I was born in Washington County in East Tennessee. I was a rather adventurous young man. At 4 years of age, I decided to run away from home and join the militia that was headed to Texas to fight in the Mexican War. I think it was the fact that I hadn't shaved and I was only about this tall that sort of gave me away. They sent me back home, but the next year I had a better plan. This time I took a horse and took off for Texas. Didn't last very long either. They figured out it was just a tall horse and a short boy, so I got sent home again. I studied law at Stewart College, was practicing law in Knoxville in 1860 when the great Satan, Abraham Lincoln himself, decided to invade our Southland. We were not going to stand by for an invasion of the evil empire from the north, so I, like 132,000 other Tennesseans, offered my services to the Army of the Confederate States of America. I enlisted in Company E, 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment out of Knoxville. Our first engagement of the war was at Mill Springs, Kentucky in January of 1862, where I received a battlefield promotion to second lieutenant. Our next engagement was down at Shiloh on the Tennessee River in April of 1862. We were then part of George Manny's brigade. General Manny is buried here in this cemetery. We were on the flank attack that finally broke the back at the Hornet's Nest. On our flank was the cavalry, under then a very obscure lieutenant colonel, but when I saw him on the field of battle, I knew this man was someone to watch. His leadership and his courage on the battlefield, the way he led from the front, marked him as a man of greatness. And this obscure lieutenant colonel was Nathan Bedford Forrest. I was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, sent home to recuperate, and while I was reading a newspaper article about our victory at Drury's Bluff, I decided I want to be a Marine. The Confederates had fortified the bluff and blocked the James River to keep the Union fleet from coming upriver and taking our capital at Richmond. The gunners, and there was a Confederate Marine gun crew at Drury's Bluff. The gunners were firing downriver, and along the riverbank were Marine sharpshooters and snipers that were picking off the Union gunners on board the ships as they came up the river. They had a hard time aiming their guns and ducking and dodging all of these bullets that were flying at them from the riverbank. I said, that's the group I want to be with. So I received a transfer to the Confederate Marine Corps, reported to Camp Beale at Drury's Bluff, which was a combination of Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island and the Officers Basic School at Quantico, Virginia. That was where Confederate Marines were trained. I went through my Marine training there and was then assigned to my first duty station as a Marine officer in Charleston, South Carolina. I was part of the security for the naval base there, and that's been the duty of Marines since the Marine Corps was first founded, to provide security for the naval bases. I was then transferred to the CSS Charleston. I was in charge of the broadside gun crew, and the Charleston was an ironclad warship that was protecting the entrances to Charleston Harbor. We repulsed 3 amphibious assaults on Sullivan's Island, where the Union soldiers were trying to take Battery Wagner from the land side. In 1864, I was transferred to Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, Wilmington was one of the major blockading ports. The blockade runners would slip out of there at night, head across the Atlantic, and dock in either the Bahamas or Bermuda. They would meet the larger British ships there. We would trade our cotton for their war materials, come back, run along the coast at night, and then slide past the blockade squadron and into the ports. So it was vitally important to keep the port of Wilmington open. I was assigned to the Marine detachment on board the CSS Raleigh, which was another ironclad warship. We nicknamed this ship the Ladies' Warship because the women of the South sold their jewelry, their china, clothing, anything they had to raise money to outfit this warship. So we were very appreciative, ladies, of your effort that you gave us in putting this ship to sea. The Raleigh was an outstanding ship. In May of 1864, it took down the Fear River, past Fort Fisher, past Battery Buchanan, Federal Point, and turned and went out and took on the blockade squadron. We sank 3, put 2 more out of commission, but unfortunately, as we were returning across the bar, the Navy ran our ship aground, broke the beam, which they literally broke the back of the ship, and it had to be scuttled. I was then assigned to the CSS Tallahassee. Now, the Tallahassee was a different kind of ship. This was a commerce raider. This was more of the sailing ship type than rather the ironclad. We were sent out to attack the U.S. Merchant Marine. The idea being that if enough of these commerce raiders were traveling all over the globe, like the Alabama, the Shenandoah, the Florida, and actually the CSS Nashville, we could put enough damage to the merchant fleet of the U.S. that they would either, 1, sue for a peace or an armistice, or number 2, they would pull blockading ships off of the blockade of southern ports to try to hunt down the commerce raiders. We took 33 prizes and burned all 33 of them. One thing I would like to point out is we never robbed civilians, unlike the U.S. Army that came into the South. We took the passengers and crews off the ship, transferred them to a neutral vessel, British, French, or whoever we could hail on the high seas, and then of course we burned the cargo on the ship, but we did not rob civilians. After the Tallahassee, one thing I would like to point out, we got within 12 miles of New York City. We had planned a raid on New York City, but we were running low on coal, and we didn't want to get trapped inside the Verrazano Narrows in New York Harbor there. We were going to hit the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And we didn't want to get caught there without enough coal to steam out of there, so we called off our raid on New York. Didn't even get to go into town and see a Yankees game that night. After the cruise on the Tallahassee, I was assigned to the mortar battery at Fort Fisher, and we repulsed the attack against Fort Fisher in December of 1864. This was the only time during the war that Confederate Marines and U.S. Marines were on the same field of battle. We did not fight against each other. We were on different parts of the field, but I would like to point out the U.S. Marines were repulsed and did not get into Fort Fisher. We drove off the Navy and the Marines. It was not until January of 1865 that the fort was finally overrun, and the Army had to help them out on that. I was wounded during that battle, sent to Richmond to recoup, and it was while I was in the Naval Hospital in Richmond that it had to be evacuated. I traveled in with Lee's Army, and we were surrendered and paroled at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. I returned to Nashville after the war in 1866. I married Margaret Lockhart of Clarksville, Tennessee. I continued my law practice. I then became part owner and editor of the Nashville American, which was the forerunner of the Nashville Banner, which I'm sorry to say we no longer have as a good conservative paper in Nashville anymore. I was appointed as the clerk for the U.S. District Court in 1886, and in the early 1900s I met with President Theodore Roosevelt when he came to Nashville at the old Maxwell House, which is down at the corner of 4th and Church Street. I think this was the time that Roosevelt said something to the effect that Maxwell House Coffee has used ever since as their logo, that "Bully, this is coffee that is good to the last drop," and they still use that on Maxwell House Coffee. Had a discussion with the President of the United States. He was trying to convince us that we should be glad that we lost the war. And I said, sir, with all due respect, how could we fight for 4 years for our independence and then be glad that we lost? And he apologized and said, I won't bring it up anymore. And he didn't. And I have a lot of respect for President Roosevelt because he signed the executive order that had our captured battle flags returned to the South. I continued my law practice in Nashville. As I said, I served as clerk for the U.S. District Court. In 1928, we were living over in Hillsborough Village off of 21st on Convent Place. I had a rather unusual accident. I fell off of a streetcar and fractured my hip, and several days later died at St. Thomas Hospital. Lieutenant Henry Melville Doak is buried across the road and down the hill there in that section of the cemetery. If you have any questions about the Marine service during the war, or about the uniform, or anything else in the life of Lieutenant Doak, I think we have a few minutes before our next group gets here. I'd be glad to answer those questions for you. Otherwise, we will turn you back to your capable guide. Yes, sir.
What about your sword?
This
Could you tell us
uniform
about
was typical of a Marine officer's uniform. Now, the Confederate officers wore the rank on the collar, and the U.S. officers wore it on the shoulder bars. The shoulder cords were typical of a Marine officer's uniform. The trousers are summer service, white cotton trousers. In the wintertime, they would wear the blue trousers with the red stripe down the leg. The sword is a little bit unusual. This is called a Mameluke sword. And this sword was presented to Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon by the Pasha of Tripoli for Lieutenant O'Bannon leading the Marines on a forced march across the Libyan desert to take the city of Tripoli from the land side during the war with the Barbary pirates in 1805. And Marine officers to this day carry this same sword. So this is what a Marine officer's sword looks like. It doesn't have the large handguard on it like a lot of the swords had back then. So the pistol is just the standard Colt Navy 6 cap and ball pistol. Any other questions?
What about the emblem on your hat?
This was the Marine emblem in the 1800s. It's the hunting horn with the M on it, as opposed to the eagle, globe, and anchor that the Marines use on the uniform today. So there was a little bit difference of the uniform. Some of the symbols that were used by the Marine Corps at that time. The Confederate Marines never had more than about 650 men. The Confederate Congress authorized 10 companies, which, you know, if they were full strength, had been 10 times 100 or 1,000, but like most Confederate units, we were understaffed. So they think from the records there were about 650 to maybe 700 officers and enlisted men that served in the Confederate Marine Corps during the course of the war. And as I said, they served on board ships as ship security, gun crews, and security at the Navy yards. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much. Hope you enjoy your tour.
First thing I need to tell you folks is that it was politics that drove me to my grave. And by the way, my actual grave is just across the road. You'll pass it as you're walking away from here. You'll notice Bell on the front of it. Maybe some of you wonder, who in the world is John Bell? Well, amongst other things, I ran for president against Abraham Lincoln. And if I'd been elected president, there would have been no war. Permit me to tell you a bit about myself. My grandfather settled in these parts in 1783. He fathered 19 children. I was born in 1796, and I grew up not too far from here, out off Old Nolensville Pike. As a youngster, I always enjoyed reading and just thinking. I ended up attending Cumberland College. Now, the nation wasn't much older than I was at that time, but the nation was so full of itself and pride over having stood up to the British the way they did. Now, the South was filled with a sense of nationalism. The state capital was over in Knoxville in those days. There wasn't any West Tennessee. There was no Memphis. In fact, west of Nashville, which was the frontier, was just nothing but Indians. Now, 2 years out of college, I made a decision to run for the state senate. Now, maybe I should have run from it. That began what was a long and very difficult career for me in politics. I believe that we should have fine colleges and universities, and I thought that the states ought to fund them. It was concerns over funding issues that then prompted me in 1826 to make a run for the United States Congress. I defeated Felix Grundy. You just walk past Mr. Grundy's tomb right over here at the corner. It was the vote of Nashville's white aristocracy and the free blacks in the area that got me elected. Did you know that fully 25% of all the blacks in this area were free at that time? And you know what? They sent a band over to serenade me after the election. I always appreciated that. In Congress, I believe that we should operate with a balanced budget. I believe we should take care of debts and obligations first, and then any monies that were left over would be applied to schools and to roads. But that Congress was not to make the decisions in those matters. Any monies that were left over to be sent back to the states where the money came from to begin with. You have to understand that internal improvements are outside the pale of congressional authority. In a speech I made before Congress in 1829 regarding the Cumberland Road Bill, I advised the congressman that the U.S. Constitution did not give Congress the authority to establish a system of roads. Well, one of the gentlemen piped up and said, well, what if a state gives the right-of-way? I said, no, sir. A state cannot add to the powers of the general government. The danger seemed obvious to me as well. The states would start looking toward the general government as the dispenser of money. The federal government would become everything and the states would become nothing. Well, by 1832, it was pretty obvious that we had a very hungry general government on our hands. And the only real income came from tariff monies. We didn't have any income tax yet. Mr. Lincoln and his Yankee cohorts would in due time take care of that issue. South Carolina nullified the high tariff law. President Andrew Jackson had to threaten South Carolina. Finally, a compromise was agreed upon on a slightly lower tariff. But honestly, had it not been for cooler heads like Mr. Clay and Mr. Calhoun, South Carolina would have seceded from the Union right then in 1832. Well, nearly 3 decades later, these constitutional issues still remain. That's when I decided, I actually agreed to run for president under the banner of a new party called the Constitutional Union Party. I carried 3 states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. Mr. Breckinridge carried the rest of the South, and of course Mr. Lincoln carried the North. Were you aware Abraham Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot in the South? I believe that such a regional candidacy as his could only lead to secession. And I also believe the choice of Abraham Lincoln to be president was done so with a callous disregard for the consequences. Well, Mr. Lincoln himself had said before Congress in a speech in 1847, he said, any people have a right at any time to rise up and throw off the current government and set up one that is more to their own liking. Well, the South took him up on that. The first state to go was South Carolina. Then all the Gulf states from Florida across to Texas seceded. In February of '61, Tennessee voted to remain in the United States. We believed secession was legal, we just weren't quite as upset about things as the other states were. In March of '61, I made my way off to Washington City to attend Mr. Lincoln's inauguration. And while I was there, I had a meeting with Mr. Lincoln, at which time I advised him that I thought the best course of action was just to let them go in peace. And I came back to Tennessee thinking Mr. Lincoln was going to adopt a pacifistic policy in the matter. Only to discover later that behind the scene all the while, Mr. Lincoln had been conspiring to reinforce Fort Sumter. 5 months after secession, South Carolina finally lost her patience and opened fire. Now, we weren't all that upset to learn that South Carolina had opened fire at Fort Sumter. But when word came that Mr. Lincoln expected Tennessee to provide troops to invade the Confederacy, that did it. Never seen attitudes change so fast. I mean overnight. Governor Harris sent word back to Mr. Lincoln, Tennessee will not provide one single man for the purposes of coercion. So Tennessee seceded from the Union. And I believe we had every right to do so. Perhaps my sentiments might best be expressed by the words of General Robert E. Lee, who was quoted as saying, "A nation held together by a bayonet holds no charm for me." I thank you for your time. Good evening.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marion Scott Pilcher. I was a very prominent man in my period. I was a steamboat captain, and during this period in American history, steamboats were the backbone of this part of the nation. John Fitch developed the first steamboat in 1787. He ran it up and down the Delaware River. It had a steam engine and a dozen canoe paddles attached to it to give it power to go up and down the rivers, unlike the paddle wheels that I used during my time period. I was raised in Kentucky. My family, or my father, was born in Culpeper County, Virginia. Like most of you here, most Tennesseans, good Tennesseans that we are, most of our families came from Virginia or the Carolinas and moved west after the American Revolution because everybody was hungry for new land. And after the end of the war, this part of the country opened up. A lot of the land out here was used to actually pay the wages of the Revolutionary War soldiers. You will learn a little bit about the war and the reasons why a lot of people fought for the Confederacy when you go over to see Mr. John Overton over at the next stop. He will explain some of it to you then. And you'll also learn more about why Kentucky, they became the 15th state of the United States at the time in 1792. My father and mother, they moved to Kentucky in 1793 after it became a state. Tennessee became the 16th state, but they really did not want to become part of the new union or the new federal government. Tennessee has always been very independent. They voted to become part of the states, but very begrudgingly they became part of those. My son Matthew, he will talk to you about why a lot of people fought for the Confederate independence.
Hi, Dad. It's good to have you all here. I understand you come to see a real Confederate soldier. Well, you've come to the right place. As for us Tennesseans, you know, the war began when Abraham Lincoln called our governor and asking for troops to go and invade the new Confederate nation. Governor Harris would not comply with his request, so Tennesseans decided that they would succeed. Over 70% of Tennesseans supported the right to succession. You see, it was all right to become a state. It was all right to succeed as a state. Now Kentucky, on the other hand, that's a different story. As my father told you, he was from Kentucky. Kentucky decided to stay neutral during this conflict. However, there were 100 delegates from the state of Kentucky that met in Richmond, our capital. And so we did represent Kentucky on our flag with the star. The 13th star on the Confederate flag is hers. There's a town in Kentucky that I was wounded at. It was called Perryville. I remember it as if it was yesterday. The scary thing is that we were outnumbered. There were so many Yankees, and even scarier than that was the Yankee artillery. You see, I was in the 1st Tennessee, General Manning's brigade, and we were under the direction of General Cheatham's division. General Cheatham ordered us to go through the woods and cut off the Yankee line. We did just that. But then those Yankees started pounding us with that artillery. We all hit Mother Earth to try to save our skin. Some of my best friends died there. I was wounded, but we took and captured those Yankee artillery there. General Cheatham said it was the best moment in his career to see us take those Yankees and capture their artillery there. As I said, I was wounded, but I did heal enough to be able to go and fight at another battle in Franklin. It was a very bloody battle. Many of my friends died there as well.
At the Battle of Perryville, the Confederate forces actually won the battle overall. They gave devastating losses to the Union forces. The Confederate forces lost a lot of men of their own. They withdrew and went back to Murfreesboro to regroup, reorganize, and heal themselves and get ready for their next engagement. Unfortunately, for my wife Nancy and myself, Matthew was injured at the Battle of Perryville. But luckily for us, he was not killed. And the reason he wasn't killed is in his breast pocket, he had a small New Testament, small Bible. The mini ball, as it traveled across the field that would have taken his life and struck him down, hit this Bible. And that's this Bible you see here on the table. And you can see on the corner of the Bible where the mini ball was stopped. He was injured and was left behind at Perryville to recover from his wounds. A very nice lady there by the name of Mrs. Rochester took him in and was nursing him back to health when Nancy and I heard of his injuries. We very quickly got ourselves together, went to Perryville, and helped nurse him back to health. Unfortunately, when he was well enough to travel, the Union forces had their own ideas, and he was taken as a prisoner of war, and kept so until April 29th of 1863. In the earlier days of the war, prisoner exchange was still taking place. So lucky for us, Matthew was exchanged as a war prisoner. He went on through the war, rejoined his men, and at the Battle of Franklin, he was struck down again. The Battle of Franklin was the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. You've heard of Gettysburg, you've heard of Shiloh. None of them compared to the Battle of Franklin. 1,750 Confederate soldiers died at the Battle of Franklin. Thousands more lay wounded on the field. My wife Nancy and I got ourselves together and went down to Franklin again, this time to nurse him back to health the second time. When we arrived there, we learned of another family who weren't lucky enough to be able to nurse their son back to health. The Carter family, where the brunt of the battle took place around their home, had gone out after the battle to walk the battlefield, and just a couple hundred yards from the front door of their house, they found the dead body of their own son, who had been trying to make his way through the lines to actually visit the family when the Confederate forces caught up with him and rejoined his forces and fought the Battle of Franklin. It was a very cold, icy winter during December of '64 and January of 1865. While we were nursing Matthew back to health, I caught pneumonia and was placed on a bed beside Matthew's bed, and then later died there beside my son, and I'm buried here before you.
Lucky or unlucky? Yeah, I was lucky that I made it out with just a wound. But then unlucky that my father comes to see me and visit me and cheer me up, and he dies. It should have been me. I was the one wounded. There's a lot of other things about this war that I remember, but they're too hurtful to think about and talk about now. But I did live a long life after the war. Matter of fact, I helped raise money to have that monument there at Confederate Circle that you see. And I also worked with Tom Ryman to raise money for a new church. It was called Ryman Tabernacle. I believe people say it's an auditorium these days. And I was very much involved with the Emmanuel Baptist Church, which still stands today, until I died in 1905. Thank you all for coming.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am John Overton Jr. I am pleased to have your company. It is not my custom to entertain like this. It's usually in my house, but under the circumstances, my being deceased, nothing has been prepared. speaking of my house, perhaps you've heard of it, Travelers Rest. Not only did it survive the Battle of Nashville, but it's still standing today and still receiving visitors. It was built by my father, the judge, in 1799. Speaking of my father, he was born in Virginia and had read law before he came to Nashville in 1789. Tennessee was still a territory of North Carolina, and this area was known as the Merrill District and later Davidson County. Now, Father's older brother, Thomas Overton, was a hero in the Revolutionary War and had served with General Washington. And it's because of this connection that President Washington appointed Father supervisor of the federal excise tax when Tennessee became a United States territory in 1790. Now, Father may have made his greatest impact on the state in the early 1800s when he and Andrew Jackson and General James Winchester founded Memphis in a site that was known as the Fourth Chickasaw Bluff. It was the highest point in the Mississippi River between Illinois and Louisiana. Now, Jackson had purchased West Tennessee from the Chickasaw, but before the wax on the treaty papers had cooled, he and General Winchester and Father were roping off a section to form a town. Winchester said the area was the Mississippi River was the Nile of this continent, and so he named the site Memphis. Now, it was my good fortune to inherit most of Father's wealth, including Travelers Rest, but I did not squander it. Father had covered the hillsides with peach, pear, and apple orchards, and much of it went into wine and brandy. Father was well known for his peach brandy. Then when I was 38, I began my famous hotel, the Maxwell House, named after my dear wife Harriet's family. When Tennessee seceded from the Union in 1861, it was not yet complete, but near enough that the Confederate Army used it as a barracks until the Union Army captured Nashville in February of 1862. After that, the Union Army used it as a jail, where it was a site of a most unfortunate accident where many of our captured Confederate soldiers were killed. Now, they say I may have been the wealthiest man in the state before the war, and I had pledged my fortune to our brave new government. So it was not until after the war in 1868 that the hotel was finally completed. And happily, I've learned that it served Nashville until 1961. No doubt some of you recall the fire that destroyed it. Well, the name is still used by a new hotel, and of course the world-famous coffee also bears its name. Now, the late war was devastating to families in Nashville. When the Union Army captured Nashville, many of our prominent citizens were arrested, and I went into exile, often traveling with our army, leaving my wife Harriet to provide for our family back at Travelers Rest. In December of 1864, our army returned to free Nashville, and General John Bell Hood set up his headquarters at our house, Travelers Rest. My wife Harriet served 7 Confederate generals at our dining table during this time. It was the proudest moment of her life. But after a couple of weeks of planning, the awful battle began. The women, children, and servants were sent to the basement while our troops fought out back on our property on Peach Orchard Hill. But our small army was badly defeated and had to retreat south with the Union Army close behind. Of course, it was difficult recovering from the war. Harriet and I worked hard to honor our soldiers who had taken up arms to defend the South. I was president of the Memorial Association when the monument was placed on Confederate Circle here in this very cemetery. But I bent your ear long enough. Y'all have a good evening, and hope you come by and see me again sometime. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. Brigadier General William Nelson Rector Bill at your service. It'll be my honor to share with you a little bit about my military service in the late unpleasantness. But I feel obliged to tell you that this is not where I am buried. I am actually buried back there closer to that tree line near Generals Cheatham and Maney, alongside my beloved wife Felicia Bass, whose brother I believe you'll meet a little bit later this evening. Though I was born in Bardstown, Kentucky in 1826, my family moved to the Arkansas Territory before my 10th birthday, and I've always considered that to be my home. That's where I received my appointment to West Point in 1844. I graduated 4 years later as a second lieutenant of the infantry, and my first years in service were in the Northwest as an infantry officer, until my transfer to Kansas in 1855 to Kansas and the cavalry. I spent the next 6 years gaining valuable combat experience fighting the Comanche and other Plains Indians. Now, the Comanche, who I consider to be some of the best light cavalry in history, were fearsome warriors. They rode into battle full tilt, screaming like demons in hopes of panicking their opponents. Now, the reason I even bring this up is that the Comanches especially liked to raid down into Texas. Well, when they did, they often came up against companies of Texas Rangers. Now, the Texas Rangers were not panicked by this screaming. In fact, they took to screaming of their own when they rode into battle against the Comanche. And when these Texas Ranger companies were mustered into Confederate service, they took to screaming like demons when they rode against Yankee cavalry. And I sincerely believe that this is the origins of our own rebel yell, as other Confederate troops began to take up this practice of screaming when they went into battle. Now, I left my command in summer of 1861, when Arkansas, like Tennessee, refused to send troops to Lincoln's call to invade the South, and instead voted to join the new Confederacy. I enlisted in the CS Army at the same rank I had last held in the U.S., as a captain of cavalry. And my first appointment was back home in Arkansas on the staff of General Earl Van Dorn. Now, my experience fighting Comanche proved very useful fighting Yankees, and he's twice recommended my promotion to colonel. Now, in April of 1862, Congress finally acted on his recommendation, but instead of colonel, I was promoted to brigadier general and given command of General Beauregard's mounted troops around Corinth, Mississippi, after the Battle of Shiloh. Soon, however, I was given command of Port Hudson, Louisiana, in order to shore up its defenses. Now, Port Hudson sat on a 50-foot bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, and along with Vicksburg, these two sites were crucial to our control in the Mississippi, and the Mississippi was our lifeline. Now, early in 1863, Richmond sent us a new commander, in Major General Franklin Gardner. Now, Franklin was a Yankee. He was born in New York, the son of a staunch Unionist, but his devotion to our cause was beyond question, and he was a very able leader and my close friend. Now, many of our troops had not seen combat, but Franklin was able to instill in them a fierce discipline and determination, which served us well over the next few weeks as we were subjected to bombardment after bombardment by the U.S. Navy, who were trying to knock us off our perch. Well, we held on. And in May of 1863, the U.S. Army sent in 30,000 troops to cut off our 7,000. We had no hope of any reinforcement and no hope of any resupply. And when the Yankees attacked soon thereafter, this was one of the very first battles in the war where they used black troops in combat. The Yankee newspapers, in fact, said these black troops planted their colors amidst the 38th Mississippi Infantry and tore the flesh off our boys with their teeth. Well, no troops, Yankee troops, black or white, got within 200 yards of our line, and they left 2,000 dead on the field while the 38th Mississippi suffered no casualties. In June, they assaulted our lines a second time, coming charging out of the Magnolia Forest right at the center of our line where I was in command. Well, we blew this assault to pieces also, and they left 1,800 men on the field to our 47. Over the next few weeks, they lost another 4,000 troops to disease and sunstroke. The Louisiana sun can be a tough mistress to an ill-prepared Yankee. Well, what the combined efforts of the U.S. and CS, the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy were unable to do, starvation finally did. Now, General Gardner tried to keep up our morale. He smoked the very first magnolia leaf cigar, which is a very tough smoke, let me tell you. And he ate the very first mule steak, which is even tougher. But you cannot ask a starving man to continue fighting. And finally, on July 9th, 1863, we were forced to surrender after 47 days of siege, which remains the longest siege that any American command has withstood, U.S. or CS, to this day. Now, to Gardner's credit, even then he refused to submit until the Yankees could prove to us that Vicksburg had already surrendered 5 days earlier on July 4th. Now, only half of our men still had the strength to stand on their own, and the Yankees had to carry the other half out of our fortifications on stretchers. Well, they shipped us all up north to Yankee prisons. And I can't even begin to tell you the horrors of places like Elmira in New York or Fort Johnson on Lake Erie, where most of us were sent. Or the plight of Southern boys who were captured at places like winter battles like Nashville and were sent north without shoes or overcoats in unheated freight cars like cattle. Now, our boys died by the dozens in prison, and it's a miracle any of them survived. Now, the Yankees, they like to howl about Andersonville and its horrors, but let me tell you, a higher percentage of Confederate prisoners died in Yankee hands than Yankees died in Southern prisons. And to their everlasting shame, they had the resources to take care of their prisoners and chose to withhold them, while the South had very little left to share. In fact, in the last winter of the war, we tried to release unilaterally all the wounded and sick prisoners that we held, and the Yankees refused to accept them, and we had no choice but return them to prison to watch them die. In order to attempt to relieve our prisoners' conditions up north, President Davis in 1864 secured my parole and appointment as a cotton broker. I was allowed to set up an office in downtown New York City, and any ship that I appointed was allowed to pass through the federal blockade of our ports loaded with cotton. I sold this cotton on the brokerage firms in New York City and used the funds to buy clothing and blankets and food for our prisoners held in northern prisons. And I continued to do this work long after our last army had surrendered and after most of our prisoners had been returned south, finally joining them myself in August of 1865. Now, I am a soldier by trade, but I am proudest of the work I did in 1865, selling cotton and providing for our prisoners. I thank you for your attention. Have a good evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. William J. Bass, and I'm buried over here in Section 1. I was just looking through a couple of biographies of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a very interesting man. I rode with Forrest for a short time during the war. Tonight I was hoping to introduce you to my lovely wife Caroline, but she telegraphed in sick. So you'll be listening to me tell a little bit of a story. As a doctor, when the war started, I thought perhaps it wasn't my place to fight. In fact, Tennesseans thought the war might be pretty short, and early indicators said that we were right. General Beauregard had our main army in Manassas, south of Washington City, about 25 miles. The Yankee army poured out of Washington, followed by congressmen, their wives, and other politicians who assumed they were going to sit on a hillside and have a picnic and watch the boys in blue rout us. Well, It was the Yankee Army that was defeated that day. In fact, they were badly routed. After the battle, I decided to go to Virginia to help take care of some of the wounded. You earlier met Miss Jane Thomas over here, and she went with me and did some other folks. In fact, Tennesseans were elated. We thought the war might end very quickly, and we felt that we were certainly safe from any invasion. I lived with my wife, Caroline, at a 1,000-acre plantation called Mount Hickory, about 6 miles up Charlotte Pike. It was owned by her daddy, William Watkins. He owned the property from the Pike all the way back to the river. It was a nice house. It was a huge house. It had 15 rooms. And as she was their only daughter, it was a very comfortable arrangement for me. The house was nice. It had stone that was quarried from the property. It had brick that were manufactured there. The floors were ash. The shingles were cedar, as both those trees were very plentiful on the property. In fact, we had everything we needed. We had everything we needed until the Yankees invaded and occupied Nashville. Suddenly, store owners that wouldn't take the U.S. oath of allegiance had no stores. And everyday items just disappeared. Things like coffee were non-existent. We tried substitutes, things like parched sweet potato peelings, but you can imagine how that tasted. It was terrible. Nashville never should have fallen so quickly. In February of 1862, the U.S. Navy sailed up the Cumberland toward Fort Donelson, but our artillery drove them back. Then they came forward with their army and surrounded the fort. The fort capitulated, and so did most of our men. Most of our men. But Nathan Bedford Forrest went to the generals and he said, "I didn't sign up to surrender." And he gained their permission to make a breakout if he could, and he did. And he rode through Charlotte, headed toward Nashville. And that's how I met him. As he and his men came up Charlotte Pike, they naturally stopped at Mount Hickory. I tended to the wounded men. My wife and the servants prepared food for his men. Then I started to rethink my position. The war was on our doorsteps. It was my duty to enlist. And Forrest commissioned me a captain to raise a company to operate behind enemy lines. Forrest and his men went on then to Nashville. Everybody knew the Yankee Army and Navy were going to be there in just a few days. Chaos was reigning, but to his credit, Forrest got everything in order. He packed up a lot of machinery, a lot of supplies, put them on trains headed south, and Nashville was in good shape when the Federals actually took it. In October of that same year, 1862, my men and I were operating behind enemy lines. We were camped west of Nashville, and it gave me a chance to meet with my wife for a night. We were supposed to go out and capture U.S. pickets, and I thought this might be my last chance. I admit I was nervous in doing that, and I tossed and I turned all night. About 4 o'clock, I knew I couldn't sleep. I got up, I woke the cook, asked her to fix breakfast, and I went outside to check on my horse. The sky was a little bit of gray, but I could make out riders trotting up the road from the pike. I thought it was my men. Not a word was spoken. Suddenly there was a flash and I was on the ground. I heard those men laughing, and suddenly from the house came my wife and her father. They stood over me. Somehow they carried me in the house. I was looking for my 4 children and thinking about the one that was on the way. And I bled to death in my own house as those soldiers ate the breakfast that had been prepared for me.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Caroline Meriwether Goodlett, and I grew up on a thoroughbred horse farm just north of here in Kentucky. When war came to the South, my father provided thoroughbred horses for Generals Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Hunt Morgan, Albert Sidney Johnston, and many others. I did my part for the war effort by riding behind the lines to deliver much-needed medicine. My brother was a colonel in the Confederate cavalry. He was killed, sadly, at Nathan Bedford Forrest's first victory, Sacramento, Kentucky. Though Forrest won the battle, it was a hollow victory because of my brother's death. After the war, I moved to Nashville in part so that my son could attend Vanderbilt. With all the news in recent weeks of Confederate Memorial Hall at Vanderbilt, I trust you've heard of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I founded that organization here in Nashville in 1894 and served as its first president. We were the daughters of the veterans of the Second Revolution. The Yankees, however, called our fathers rebels. But you cannot be a rebel if you're loyal to your state. Well, the Yankees were writing the history books of the war, and we could see our war for independence being reduced to a civil war. There was much work to be done for the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and we set our goals as historical, benevolent, educational, patriotic, and memorial. My friend Mrs. Porter here did great work to set up hospitals for our Confederate soldiers.
Good evening. I'm Felicia Ann Porter. I was a Grundy. I trust you remember my father, Senator Felix Grundy. He and my mother were born in Virginia during our first revolution. You know, the one against England. They moved to West as young adults and settled in Nashville. I have two older sisters. Do you remember your earliest childhood memories? I think mine was when I was 4 years old. I was amidst a huge crowd, and my father lifted me to his shoulder so that I could see Mary, my 15-year-old sister, speaking to the crowd. I didn't understand it at the time, but it was Lafayette's 1825 visit to Nashville. When the French Navy cut off Cornwallis at Yorktown, Lafayette shared in the victory and won the hearts of the colonists.
And didn't they name Lafayette Avenue after him?
Yes, they did. They named Lafayette Avenue after him in Nashville, and various other things were named after him in Tennessee and other southern states.
Nashville was an important city long ago, even before we were the state capital. Nashville's strength is its good people, and I became friends with Mrs. Porter's mother through our joint charitable work. We were concerned with the poor of the city. Felicia's much too modest to tell you of her mother's great work. She recognized that the poor children of the city needed to be able to read the Bible, but their parents could not afford to send them to school. So she set up an outdoor Sunday school and taught them to read. Some Nashville ministers said that spelling classes were secular education and inappropriate for Sunday. One minister even went as far as to say it was a scheme of the devil to capture the youth of the city. Really? And I think of all that Felicia's family did to establish our hospitals.
You may not remember my father, but I hope you remember my mother. The inscription on her grave reads, Anne Grundy, our mother, who taught us how to live and how to die. I've done work with my friend Miss Caroline Goodlett too. Have you seen the monument at Confederate Circle? In 1887, we incorporated to raise funds for the monument, and Miss Caroline and I served as vice presidents on the monument committee. Our efforts soon came to fruition, and we had an Italian sculptor carve the soldier that stands atop the monument. Can you imagine, on a warm spring day in May of 1889, 10,000 people attended the unveiling ceremony at Confederate Circle. Colonel John Overton, you know, of Traveler's Rest, said, "The ladies of the Tennessee have not ceased to remember their heroic dead."
Our heroic dead, bless their memory. Well, in 1900, the United Daughters of the Confederacy became concerned with the impoverished veterans who had been unable to send their daughters to college. But let me relapse a bit, please. Do you know of all the colleges and universities the U.S. Army burned? Why, over in Lebanon, Cumberland College was burned. The University of Alabama, VMI, not to mention all the colleges that never found money to rebuild. It was a devastating setback to education in the South. And to think the Yankees made jokes about it. Do you remember all the ladies and gentlemen? I'm Caroline Meriwether Goodlett. And I grew up on a thoroughbred horse farm just north of here in Kentucky. When war came to the South, my father provided thoroughbred horses for Generals Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Hunt Morgan, Albert Sidney Johnston, and many others. I did my part by riding behind the lines to deliver medicine to the troops. My brother, too, did his part. He was a colonel in the Confederate cavalry. He was killed in Nathan Bedford Forrest's first victory at Sacramento, Kentucky. Though Forrest won the battle, my brother's death made it a hollow victory for my family. Well, after the war, I moved to Nashville, in part so that my son could attend Vanderbilt. With all the news in recent weeks of Confederate Memorial Hall at Vanderbilt, I trust you know of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I founded that organization here in Nashville in 1894 and served as its first president. We were the daughters of the veterans of the Second Revolution. The Yankees, however, called our fathers rebels, but you cannot be a rebel if you're loyal to your state. Well, the Yankees were writing the history books of the war, and we could see our war for independence being reduced to a civil war. There was much work to be done for the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and we set our goals as historical, benevolent, educational, memorial, and patriotic. My good friend Mrs. Porter here did great work to set up hospitals for our Confederate soldiers.
Good evening. I'm Felicia Ann Porter. I was a Grundy. I trust you've heard of my father, Senator Felix Grundy. He and my mother were born in Virginia during our first revolution. You know, the one against England? As young adults, they moved west and settled in Nashville. I have 2 older sisters. Do you remember your earliest childhood memories? I think mine was when I was 4 years old. I was amidst a huge crowd, and my father lifted me to his shoulders so I could see my 15-year-old sister Mary address the crowd. I didn't understand it then, but it was Lafayette's 1825 visit to Nashville. When the French Navy cut off Cornwallis at Yorktown, Lafayette shared in the glory of victory and won the hearts of the colonists. The citizens of Nashville named Lafayette Avenue after him.
Yes, Nashville was an important city long ago, even before we were the state capital. Nashville's strength was its good people. I became friends with Mrs. Porter's mother through our joint charitable work. We were concerned with the poor. Felicia's much too modest to tell you of her mother's great work. She recognized that the poor children of the city needed to be able to read the Bible, but their parents could not afford to send them to school. She set up an outdoor Sunday school and taught them to read. Some Nashville ministers said that spelling classes were secular education and inappropriate for Sunday. And one minister went as far as to say that it was a scheme of the devil to capture the youth of the city. Really? And to think of all that Felicia's family did to establish our hospitals.
You may not remember my father, but I hope you remember my mother. The inscription on her grave reads, Anne Grundy, our mother, who taught us how to live and how to die. I've also done work with my friend Miss Caroline Goodlett. Have you seen the monument at Confederate Circle? In 1887, we incorporated to raise funds for the monument, and Miss Caroline and I served as vice presidents on the monument committee. Our efforts soon came to fruition, and we had an Italian sculptor carve the Confederate soldier that stands atop the monument. Can you imagine a beautiful spring day in May of 1889, 10,000 people attended the unveiling ceremony at Confederate Circle. Colonel John Overton of the McGavick House and Travelers Rest, thank you. He stated, "The ladies of Tennessee have not ceased to cherish the memories of their heroic dead."
Our heroic dead, bless their memory. Well, in 1900, the United Daughters of the Confederacy became concerned with the impoverished veterans who were unable to send their daughters to college. But let me relapse a bit, please. Do you know of all of the colleges and universities that the U.S. Army burned? Why, over in Lebanon, Cumberland College was burned. The University of Alabama, VMI, not to mention all the colleges that never found money to rebuild. It was a devastating setback for education in the South. And to think, the Yankees made jokes about it. Do you remember all the classes from our universities that went off to war from such states as North Carolina and Mississippi and Georgia?
So sad.
They never came back. They were to be the future leaders of the South. Well, after the war, the South was broke as the North grew rich. But a wealthy Northerner named George Peabody wanted to see public schools in the South. He established the $2 million Peabody Education Fund to promote public schools and education throughout the 11 former Confederate states. And in 1902, the UDC began working with Peabody, who was establishing a teacher's college here in Nashville, to build a dormitory for young women, you know as Confederate Memorial Hall. Well, the first classes were held in 1914, which was the year that I died. But I've since learned that the money was raised and the dormitory built during the Depression of the 1930s. I think of all the work to honor our Confederate ancestors, and I'm gladdened to know that the name Confederate Memorial Hall will continue to grace that building. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and please do come again. We don't get very many visitors up here.